Welcome. It is the North Side Baseball Podcast. This is episode 2. I am Mitch Widmeyer. He is Matt Trueblood. Matt, appreciate you kind of setting aside a chunk of time here to talk some Cubbies baseball. And I know you're actually in Arizona for spring training, covering the Cubs a little bit, the Brewers. How have things been so far in Arizona for you?
Yeah, I'm pretty much just embedded with the Brewers out here. We're hoping maybe next year we'll be more involved with the Cubs during spring. But it's been going great, and obviously it's a great time of year. Baseball's in the air. It's in the conversation everywhere you turn. It's awesome.
Yeah, I know we had kind of talked beforehand a little bit too, and I think it's not specific to the MLB. I know covering some preseasons with the Timberwolves in past years when I lived in Minneapolis and was the sports director for a couple of stations. In the preseason and in training camp, even the players, the coaches, they're much more kind of giddy, talkative, things with the media, and then things really buckle down in the regular season. So I think this is kind of a good time of the year for people like you in a media role who are out talking to these players, talking to the coaches, the manager. You said like specifically with the Brewers because they are more kind of talkative and chatty this time of the year, correct?
Yeah, Brewers manager Pat Murphy he saw a few of us in the hall on the way into the clubhouse this afternoon, and he didn't have a pregame media scrum scheduled as he normally would. Sometimes with the night games, they sort of shake things up and give him that slice of time off. And Murphy actually asked why there wasn't media. He was ready for more of us than he's even getting. So I guarantee he will not be feeling that way about the beat writers come August. So that tells you a lot about how things are right now.
Yeah, and Pat Murphy and the Brewers, of course, going to try to defend their NL Central crown from a year ago. Cubs fans and the Cubs hoping that it's a different case this year in the division. We've got, as people can see on the screen, if they're watching this via video instead of audio, we've got our list of topics laid out. We'll bounce around like we always do, Matt. I wanted to start, though. Shota Imanaga really burst onto the scene last year as a 30-year-old rookie, 2.91 ERA across 29 starts. And when I say burst onto the scene, I don't know what the expectations were like internally in that clubhouse, with the staff, with the coaches. But man, externally, fans expected Shota maybe to slot in somewhere as like a number 3 or number 4 in the rotation. And almost like wire to wire, he was the most consistent and the most dominant Cubs starter. And I'm curious, I saw in his most recent spring training start, I think he whiffed the first 3 batters in the top of the first inning in his most recent outing. Is it fair to just expect some sort of regression from him, not because it's Shota, but because of how good he was as a rookie? And I feel like expectations are only going to lift up for many. So should we expect some sort of almost like regression back to the mean in year 2?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to, because regression is one of those big, strong, universal forces that doesn't care how good you are. But I also think people lean on it a little too much and maybe assume it's going to do the same amount for everybody, or it does a fixed amount based on how much we know about you, or how unlucky or unlucky you might have just gotten. It doesn't work that way. It's not like you were due for this and so you come back, you go out the other side and struggle instead, something like that. And in Imanaga's case, he's just so adaptable. He's so smart, so personable, so competitive. I think it's rare sometimes that we're able to immediately see the full personality of a person coming over from Japan, or a young player coming up who grew up in the Dominican Republic or Venezuela, because of the language barrier there. But with Imanaga, if you can't see it, you're willfully ignoring it. I mean, it does not matter if his first language is English, if he's doing translated interviews, whatever. You can hear it in his voice. You can also see it in the way he carries himself, what he does on the mound, the fact that he started the year as kind of basically a 2-pitch pitcher. He had a sweeper that he'd really only used to lefties, didn't get to it very often. He was mostly going fastball, splitter. By the end of the year, we saw 5 or 6 different pitches from Shota. And I don't mean he showed 5 or 6 to sort of see if maybe something would stick or he could catch somebody not expecting something. He genuinely had deepened his repertoire, his arsenal that way. He's just that good. at a lot of things, that eager to learn. And again, that competitive, the way the passion would come out when he'd get out of a big jam. I see all that stuff and I say regression's non-negotiable, but it doesn't have to mean that he's going to have a 4.2 ERA this year. I think he's still going to be one of the better pitchers in the National League because he is really good at adjusting and he's really good at what he does.
Yeah, I think I should have clarified a little bit, and you hit the nail on the head, at least in my opinion, Matt. When I talked about, expecting some sort of year two regression, I don't think either of us are expecting Shota to like tailspin out of control and be a guy who's, giving up nukes left and right every start and has an ERA north of 4.5 at the All-Star break. More so that because he was such a pleasant surprise with his numbers, with his command as a rookie, it almost like do you feel that though too, like with fans? Like I know my buddies, some of them are Cubs fans, are expecting Shota to like peel back another layer and be even more dominant this year, and that's where I'm like, I think if he was what he was last year, I'd be thrilled with it in his second year coming over from Japan. And so when I say regression, yeah, we're not talking about a guy who's gonna sink into the cellar of this rotation by any stretch of the imagination. And it's just I think he caught a lot of people by surprise in his first year, right? Because when you looked at the two main names that came over from Japan, it was Yamamoto, and Shota was right there behind him, at least in my opinion. But Yamamoto, many believed, was like a couple of tiers ahead of what was next. And Shota just, like I said, I think at least in Chicago with that rotation, took things over, kind of burst onto the scene, I think is how I described it. So would you agree that if he posted similar numbers year 2 to year 1, the Cubs sign up for that 10 times out of 10?
Of course. Yeah. And I think know yourself, know what, people can set whatever expectations they want to, as long as they're not going to be so attached to their expectations that they're wildly disappointed if they're not met. I guess to me, my expectation for him would be to be 90% of what we saw last year. And if there are folks who do think, we're going to see him take another step and be even better, hard to make that case. It's easy to forget because he's got this youthful vibe and he came over the same year as Yamamoto, who's only 25 years old, showed us 31, turning 32. He's probably, the odds, the actuarial tables, which are somewhere, I'm sure. I haven't seen them, but I'm sure that they say Shota's best season in MLB is the one we just saw. But I would guess that this one's going to be close to as good. And that's all I'm expecting of it. And I think as long as he stays healthy, there's a really good chance that he meets those expectations.
When you look at the Cubs rotation 1 through 5, or at least what it's projected to be, because I think that 5th spot, somewhat up for grabs, but many expect Colin Ray will be, slotted into that 5 spot. Do the Cubs, do they like need Shota to be the ace? Do they need him to be kind of the workhorse? Or do you think they have like a nice blend, hoping, Justin Steele stays healthy, and Matthew Boyd, he's had his own health concerns, but you kind of know what you get with Tyon across the course of a season. Do they need Shota to be like an absolute rock star? Do you think they have enough balance in the rotation that it would be good enough with where things are now to hopefully win the NL Central?
There's no question that basically when he took the mound last year, it was kind of like an automatic win. If you can have that guy, that makes a humongous difference. And there's a tangible difference between that and even being just very good, like Justin Steele was last year, like Jamison Tyone. Now, one guy can't sort of make up for any deficiency of dominance elsewhere in the rotation all that well, 9 times out of 10. Even, I think the Cubs went 23-6 or something in Shota starts last year. That's crazy, man. That doesn't happen, right? So that part's going to regress. The team performance around you, that part will come back. So he can't really make up for a lot of what else is going on. What he can do is be a really reliable cog in the wheel. You want to see that rotation include 3 or 4 guys who've got a chance to give you 6, maybe even 7 every turn through. Doesn't mean that they get that far every time, but that's on the table when they take the ball. We remember rotations with John Lester and Jake Arrieta and John Lackey. Bullpens don't get overworked behind rotations like those. They do get overworked behind most modern rotations, and certainly most of the ones we've seen from the Cubs lately. And Shota, along with Steele and Tyone, and even Matthew Boyd to an extent, within games, he can work relatively deep. It's, that he's probably going to be down for anywhere from 8 to 13 of his turns in the rotation per year. You want to avoid having those really short starts that Kyle Hendricks gave you too many of last year. And you want to not tax the bullpen, but that has to be a shared responsibility. Because even if Shota gives you a complete game and totally rests the bullpen now and then, like old school aces used to do, if in between you got guys struggling to get you 13 outs,
Cancels it out.
Yeah, they're all going to wear down anyway. So
it is the Northside Baseball Podcast. Mitch Widmeyer, Matt Trueblood. This is episode 2, talking Cubbies baseball. The big acquisition this offseason, of course, for Chicago, Matt. We all know it was Kyle Tucker coming over from Houston, and just kind of poking around some different topics, ideas. One thing that kind of crossed my mind is I was genuinely wondering, Matt, like, when's the last time, when we take away the defense, when's the last time they had a bat like this in the lineup, like this consistent, this productive? To me, it's so much different than when they signed Cody Bellinger. Bellinger was coming off a down season in LA. Of course he had the MVP caliber season, but it wasn't coming off of that. I believe when they signed Bellinger, there was a lot of unknowns as to if he could get back to that because of the regression that we saw. And Tucker had an injury last year, but when he was healthy and available, like, the dude's so dang good, and he's in his prime. He's proven it time and again. What do you think about the aspect of, if Kyle Tucker is who we all believe he will be, how much pressure can it take off some of these other guys in the lineup just knowing how good of a bat he has? Because again, I don't think the Cubs have had something like what we'll see with Tucker at the dish in quite some time.
Yeah, it's got to be Chris Bryant's MVP season.
That's what I was going to go back to. Yeah.
And that does make a huge difference. Now, how much, it's a little bit related to that discussion we just had about Shota, right? How much burden can you carry for your teammates? Well, the other 8 guys have to bat too. The one difference with a position player is, and Tucker's always been very well-rounded. Last year, what we saw was in less than half a season, he cracked 23 home runs. There's that kind of guy who takes it to another level. If you're an elite power hitter, Shohei Ohtani, Aaron Judge, we know what those guys are. An elite power hitter who also doesn't cancel out some of your value by making a lot of outs in the turns when you don't hit home runs. If you're a high OBP guy who also hits 45, we'll stop right there, say 45 homers. That's when you do start making up for other people in the lineup. If Kyle Tucker's getting on base 38% of the time, and one chunk of that 38% of the time is 45 bombs, yeah, you don't need as much from the bottom of your batting order, man. You've created some automatic runs there. There's no requirement that somebody else come through. So we have to see how things play this year. Obviously, he's off to a rough start in spring training. Too early to worry about that, but it is a fact. We know he's he's hopefully fully healthy and past the injury that happened last year. But the way that injury happened on this foul ball he got very good last season at going down, getting that low and in pitch and whacking it, pulling it to right field in the air. Well, it's also that kind of pitch on which he fouled the ball off his shin and broke it and ruined half of his own season. So is he going to be a little more tentative there this year? We don't have enough information yet. But if Kyle Tucker shows up and he's the guy he's always been, plus that power boost we saw last year, and he stays healthy, yeah, he makes up for tons of stuff. He takes all kinds of pressure off Pete Crow Armstrong, off Matt Shaw, off Miguel Amaya. It's a complete game changer. And that's, I think, has almost been understated for all we've tried to talk about Tucker since he was traded for. I'm not sure people are fully grasping, not that this is the most likely outcome, because the most likely outcome is probably that the the power comes back a little bit, right? And he settles into that kind of 30 homer space that he's been at most of his career. But if it really plays up at Wrigley, and he does have that power to left center field that works really well for lefties, Anthony Rizzo in his prime can tell you about that. If he gets into all of that and he is this 40 homer guy who also walks as much as he strikes out, it's a relatively small chance, but that chance is like cash your tickets, Cubs win the division. And by the way, they're in really good shape heading into October too. He has that kind of transformative potential, even if it's not the most likely thing to see.
I think if he reaches that too, is it like Matt? If is it fair to say if he that threshold you're talking about, where you say, there's a small chance he maxes all this out, but it could happen with Kyle Tucker. It's certainly in there. If it does, you're almost talking, blank check territory next offseason with some team just pushing over to his side of the table and saying, yeah, right. Like for the Cubs, it's like every homer he launches, the Cubs aren't going to be thinking this, but there will be some fans, there will at least be a pocket of the fan base that if he's, racking up these huge numbers, it's going to be in the back of the mind, like, well, the price tag is going up astronomically as well.
There will be some members of the Ricketts family having those thoughts for sure.
Yeah, that's true. So you want to see it come to fruition, but you also, everyone wants Kyle Tucker around in Chicago. Cubs fans do past this year. And so it's a little bit of a catch-22 there, but yeah, max it out as much as you can. There's so many names. You mentioned like Pete Crow-Armstrong, Matt Shaw, Amaya. You mentioned some of the younger names. Obviously, there's vets in there too. Ian Happ, Dansby Swanson. I don't know if we consider Seiya Suzuki a veteran yet. He's maybe in between, what we say with Shaw and PCA, and then names like Dansby and Happ. Who is the second most important bat in this lineup? Like I think, and you could go so many different directions, which is why I'm tossing you kind of a tricky one, I think, Matt, because I was going over it in my head, and I think you could make a case for Happ, especially if he's leading off and he's kind of that veteran calming presence. You could make a case for Dansby because I think he really needs to rebound after a rough year at the plate for large stretches of last season. I also think people could go PCA and the uber potential that he has and wanting to see him piece it all together. So who do you think is, because Tucker is by far the number one choice, who's the second most important bat in this lineup, let's just say entering the season?
Yeah, it's almost a philosophical question, isn't it? Like, are we trying to find the second best hitter in the lineup? That's pretty clearly Seiya, and maybe he's most important just because there's this big variable of, we are pretty confident he's going to slug while he's in there, he's going to be a good hitter. How healthy can he stay, especially DHing more for the full season? Is that going to keep him in the lineup more often? Because that'd be awesome. That's an important question, but it feels a little like cheating. Maybe. I'll go with, I got two, and okay. I'll throw them out to you, and you tell me which one you might lean toward, or if you have a different idea. I think of Matt Shaw, and I think of Nico Horner, because the error bars on Shaw, to me, are really wide. And I know that as a prospect profile, the selling point on him is supposed to be that the error bars aren't that wide. Well-rounded skill set, highly polished player, good makeup, fast to the big leagues. We've heard all that, and it's true as far as it goes. My questions about that humongous leg kick, which, if anything, he somehow made it bigger this year. Have you seen that thing?
Yeah, I have. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
His left cleat is like crossing his right knee sometimes.
It's insane.
It's wild. And I don't know how that's going to play in the big leagues. I do think it's going to force some adjustments. He had a couple of hits the other day. Even that came with, he was sawed off one time. The other time it was cleanly struck enough, but to right center. And I'm not saying any of that is bad. I think maybe that's what makes him special, is that feel for getting the hands to the right spot with this big, complicated seeming move. And maybe that's how he generates enough power to matter. I don't know. What I do know is it creates a lot of questions that will only be answered once he's facing big league pitching. Because you can get away with that if you're talented enough, and it's clear he's talented enough, all the way up through AAA. So the test is coming. And I think the uncertainty around his performance is much higher than most people are understanding, because they keep hearing very safe prospect, which might be true overall. I don't think it's true in terms of his offensive performance, especially in the first half, but probably even for all of 2025. And then with Nico, my case would be, we've seen a very overall, just this very tepid version of the dude. There's promise, there's flashes of brilliance, long stretches where he might put together a 370 OBP. We know what he can do on the bases when that happens. We know how bad he wants it. We got to stop dreaming on him creating power. That's never going to happen. It's not in his swing. It's not, he's strong. And I know everybody sees the forearms and they're like, that dude's got to be able to create power. Well, it's not in the forearms. He can't rotate fast enough to create the swing speed necessary to hit for a bunch of power. So we got to let that part go. And we got to ask ourselves, is he going to be able to stay healthy and piece together that 300 average, 380 OBP, holy terror on the bases? And now it doesn't matter if he hits for power. If that guy shows up, it's a catalyst for the lineup, no matter where he ends up hitting. If he earns enough of Craig Counsell's trust to go up and bat first or second, awesome. It's like 2008 Ryan Theriot, which sounds like a backhanded compliment to people. Go look up Ryan Terrio's line from 2008. I promise it's not one. And if he stays back in the 6th or 7th spot, you bet him back to back with Pete Crow Armstrong in whichever order. If both guys are going well, I do not want to be the pitcher and the team defense having to deal with all of that. So I could see either one of those guys being the catalyst to this offense, sort of the big X factor. But to me, it's probably Shaw or Horner. What do you think?
Yeah, out of those two names that you threw out, I would say Shaw. And I would say, because of the unknown, when's the last time there's been this much hype surrounding a prospect for the Cubs that's starting the year on the major league squad? Usually they start him in the minors, you get that extra year of service time, and then you bring him up sometime April, May, whenever it is. Shaw, by all indicators, he's going to start at third base. And this is not what anyone wants to happen, but if he has a slow start to the season, I can promise you there will be some that will be, they should have gone all in on Bregman, and it would have relieved some pressure off Shaw, and maybe you could have moved him to second, and then that maybe have triggered a Nico Horner trade. Like, who knows? They're big domino effect. I think the unknown with Shaw blended, Matt, with the hype around him and what some probably have as overly high, lofty expectations make him more important. With Nico, you want to see the consistency. We're begging to see him put it all together, and because we've seen it, like you said, in spurts, but in large part, we want to see the consistency. But you kind of know what you have in Nico Horner in a lot of aspects. With Matt Shaw, the unknown, and I think the not knowing what the ceiling is. What could he do if he is able to put it together quickly as a rookie? What does that look like? To me, that makes him more of an important bat in the lineup. But I get both sides of it. In another, I brought up Dansby to you. If he has another slow start, if he has another couple of months where it's like, man, this guy just can't figure it out, it creates, because you're not taking him out of the lineup, contract, the glove. Dansby Swanson's going to be in the lineup regardless, however 150 games a year. But that would create a big hole. I have my concerns with, hoping that he can bounce back, but pulling back a little bit, wondering, why did he struggle for such long stretches last year? So I think you said it was like a philosophical question. Again, I agree, because it's just what tentacle you want to take and how you want to attack it. Like for Matt Shaw, it's the rookie, it's the unknown. For Nico, it's wanting to see him put it together consistently. For Dansby, in my opinion, it's can he bounce back? For PCA, it's can he be as electric as we all believe he can be?
When we're talking about importance, I think you make a really good point that Dansby becomes pivotal, because literally he's the pivot point in the lineup right now. If you're writing out the opening day lineup, it almost certainly goes Happ, Tucker, Suzuki, Bush, Dansby, Swanson. Now, do they hope that Matt Shaw is that guy over the longer term of even this season? Probably, right? Yeah. But if Dansby is what he was right before he came to the Cubs, what he was even for parts of 2023, you can slot that guy relatively comfortably into that 5th spot in the order, and it lengthens and bridges and sort of, the whole batting order becomes more functional. And if we're just talking about importance to the team based on, we have a pretty clear idea of what to expect from those guys ahead of him. And even if we don't know what to expect individually from the guys below him, we have a general idea as a group of what they'll be able to do. It's Dansby where the error bars are wide, much wider than we think they'd be for a 31-year-old with this big, long, big league track record. And whether or not he succeeds has a disproportionate effect on how much you can cash in on the value created by the top of that lineup, right?
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Northside Baseball Podcast, Mitch Whitmire, Matt Trueblood, however you get your podcast. Appreciate you clicking the play button, whether it's Apple Podcast, our website at Northside Baseball, the YouTube page as well, which is getting jump started up. I want to dive into PCA a little bit more, Matt. Do you think the goal is to have him at the top of the order, whether it's this year, long term, at some point? I'm watching spring training games. He had a little league home run in a spring training game. I'm watching him steal second, and the ball trickles into shallow center. Like it doesn't go deep into center. It doesn't go past the center fielder. I believe it was the shortstop who came over on the play on the throw down to second, and it trickles into center, and PCA immediately pops up, takes third, and then sprints home and beats the throw.
And he almost just scored because he was angry too.
Yeah.
Where it was like, he felt like the guy was holding his heel a little bit with his gloves. He was like, that's it. I'm just taking home plate.
So I'm watching this guy, Matt, and I'm wondering to myself, and I'm wondering aloud and tossing it in your direction, like, is the goal for him to be at the top of the order at some point again, whether it's this year or we can double up? Do you think the goal is to have him top of the order if everything goes correctly this year and then obviously long term as well?
I think the Cubs would love that in theory. And we still have this vestigial impulse. If a guy has speed, put him at the top of the order. It's baked into us. We all grew up with that idea of the leadoff hitter, and it doesn't have to be tossed aside just because now we know on base skills matter more. In fact, the best leadoff hitters ever were those guys who got on base a lot because that was their game, because power wasn't. They were built more slightly. They made good swing decisions. And then, they were also fast, right? I would say, just looking at what we've seen of him so far, it's very unlikely that PCA is ever controlling the strike zone the way you need a leadoff hitter to do, that he's ever getting on base at a high enough rate to bat leadoff. That doesn't mean that he can't be an important offensive contributor. I almost think if he hits his offensive ceiling, it's probably more likely to be like that guy ends up batting third, where walks are less valuable. He's going to run into a good amount of power. Again, we're talking about a high-end percentile outcome for this guy. And he creates a lot of value overall, but more of it comes from slug, just because that's his style. That's who he is. And definitely he has to get more disciplined either way. But can he get enough more disciplined where you expect him to put up a 350 on base percentage? I don't think so. And the other important thing for people to grasp that is hard even for me sometimes, because I see a guy and I think, boy, if we can get his OBP up just to a certain threshold, let's lead him off, because that's where the speed works. That really is just something that we sort of learned. It's not necessary. In fact, in the book by Tom Tango and Mitchell Lichtman from like 2004, very old and almost out of date in some ways now, but a lot of those insights hold up. One of the things they found that I think got swept right on, they found other bigger, more important things. So people never talked about this all that much. They said, all other skills held equal, the best place to put a guy who's really good at stealing bases, who creates a lot of value in whatever way through his legs, is 5th or 6th. That's probably where PCA is going to bat this year. I would bet he spends a lot of time in that 6th spot. And that's fine. In fact, I think it could be a long-term home, because median outcome. Now, if we're shifting from what happens if PCA is that guy we saw in August to what's PCA most likely to be, it probably looks a lot like Kevin Kiermaier, who, again, not a backhanded compliment, even if it sounds like one. Everybody go look at Kevin Kiermaier's Fangraphs page or whatever you need to do. Multi-time Gold Glove winner, phenomenal defender who hit plenty, not only to be in the lineup regularly, but to occasionally be a star and to be average or slightly better pretty much every year. PCA brings that extra flavor of real chaos and energy, and let's lean into it. But it doesn't have to go at the top of the order to be catalytic. That can happen batting sixth, and he can still, you can let him develop his power, find that the way he sort of did down the stretch last year, and make the most of his skills from that spot in the order. Could he eventually bat leadoff? Yeah, but I would bet against it with, even unless you gave me really, really, really good odds, I'd be betting on the no side.
Yeah, and I think one other way to twist this into a positive, because it's not in any way, raining on PCA, is that's a hell of a bat to have in the middle of your lineup. Like a pitcher thinks he's getting over the hump at some point, right? Like going through the meat and potatoes part of your order, and then that 5-6 hole, here comes Pete Crow or Armstrong. It's like, okay, well, I can't really relax. So he might lay down a bunt down the third base line and end up at second base if we have a misthrow. Like, I love wherever they slot in PCA. He's so electric, so fun to watch. We're already seeing it in spring. He's treating spring training at bats and base running as though it's October, and the Cubs are in game 3 of the NLDS. And yeah, I believe in the value of having at least one guy that's like a true spark plug player. And I'm not saying that PCA is just a spark plug guy, because you mentioned Gold Glove type defense could be the expectation, maybe is the expectation. But to have that guy in the clubhouse that can really get everyone fired up. Like if you're in a rut, man, your team's lost, 4 or 5, and you're on a long West Coast road trip, and PCA comes up top of the second inning and just rips a triple when you've lost 4 or 5, it can kind of get things going. And I believe in the value of having and needing someone like that in the clubhouse. And I mean, he gives the team that at like an absolute minimum. He's a spark plug guy, which I love.
Yeah. I mean, he's very much like Javier Baez. And I know we may remember Javi in his very best years, 18 and 19, spent a lot of time batting second, third. He moved around. But the best teams of which Javi was a part were 2016 and 17, when he often batted sixth, because it's just the spot where he made the most sense, not because he wasn't being very productive, but because there were other guys in the lineup who were going to more reliably get on base, hit for plenty of power. And then if, a pitcher dances through, and I always think of, if you've got a pitcher kind of on the ropes in the first inning, maybe he had a single, a couple of walks, but he's also gotten 2 outs. And now are you going to break this game open right at the start? Or is he going to escape with no damage? It's that sixth hitter who's due up in those situations. So I think of the sixth spot as this sort of hidden leverage position in the batting order. It's just one scenario, but I do feel like stuff like that comes up for the guy who's batting fifth or sixth a lot. And so I'd like to have PCA there as long as he can control his emotions in those big spots and, not swing at absolutely everything. But
Javi was famous for that.
Yeah. And I mean, Javi would just absolutely flail, but Javi would also come up with a lot of big hits and a lot of those spark plug moments. We remember more of them again from 18 and 19 when he moved up because he was a more productive overall hitter. But even in 16 and 17, he could create that chaos on the bases. He could steal, he could move up, he could, generate a mistake by the defense. And that doesn't have to happen from the top of the order. It can work just as well in the heart. And then you're also, the one thing you don't want to do, as often as possible, you don't want the lower third of your order coming up with nobody on in front of them and nothing really happening. Because those are your worst hitters by definition, or unless you built your lineup really, really badly, those are your worst hitters. don't give them nothing to do. Put a bunch of people or potential runs kind of in their way and see if they just sort of bounce off the walls and knock one of them in by accident. A guy like PCA can create opportunities that don't add pressure to those hitters at the bottom of your order. They actually take pressure away by saying, all you got to do is put the ball in play here, and that dude with the blue stars in his hair is going to scamper home from third, even if you just hit a 240-foot fly ball.
Yeah, incredibly valuable. Well, one more note I wanted to I love the Javi comparison you made, especially like even if we're just talking personality wise and being that jolt for a clubhouse or for a dugout. PCA, like Javi, when he was at his the peak of his powers in Chicago, like PCA has an abundant amount of confidence, and it to me, Matt, I hope it's to the point that like I could genuinely see a scenario where if PCA's in like an 0-18 slump across a slew of games, but he comes up in the ninth inning in a big spot, he believes he's going to come through. And because of that, I'm watching it and I'm like, I believe this guy's going to come through now. Like he doesn't, it's a small sample size of what we saw last year. But even when he was going through those peaks and valleys and the slow start, like the confidence never looked like it was invisible or missing from PCA. And I like a guy who he could be in a slump. He comes up in a big moment and he's still going to believe he's going to deliver. And that kind of has a ripple effect or can have a ripple effect on the rest of the lineup as well. Do you kind of see that with him?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree.
Northside Baseball Podcast, Mitch Widmeyer, Matt Trueblood. PCA at one time was one of these, highly touted prospects. We hope he's now a mainstay at the big league level with the Chicago Cubs. Just kind of picking your brain a little bit, Matt. I'm curious, who are a couple of the top prospects for the Cubs? Maybe not even top prospects. I'll just say prospects that you're sort of keeping tabs on. And I'm talking about guys who aren't expected to start the year at the major league level, but maybe post-trade deadline, maybe around summertime. Injuries pop up, whether it's rotation, bullpen, need another bat, need another glove. Who are some of the prospects you're keeping tabs on in Chicago?
Yeah, he really can't be the answer right now because he's sort of got to go on our back burner until we find out more about his injury. But I want to shout out Brandon Birdsell because I was really excited about him coming into spring training. And then he reported, and it was immediately clear something's not quite right with his shoulder. That stinks because what a year he had scaling up from AA to AAA, changing some pitch shapes, and he's got a really funky sort of short arm delivery. There were going to be questions about how that might play in the majors, but he, while fitting what the Cubs like pitchers to do philosophically and sort of stylistically, also would have given hitters a very different look than most of their current pitchers. And good control. I was really excited about him. So I just wanted to say that off the top.
Yeah.
Who is really probably going to have an impact for them this year? Who's not Matt Shaw, who's not, starting out of the gate? I think the key names to watch are probably James Triantos and Moises Ballesteros. Triantos kind of getting overlooked, don't you think? I think
yes.
There's this cluster of top prospects, and people viewed Owen Casey as being clearly ahead of Triantos. Kevin Alcantara is ahead of him. So not that anyone didn't like James Triantos, but it's just people stop talking after they talk about two or three really exciting sort of prospects at a similar level. And it's going to turn out that Triantos is needed unless he ends up being traded instead. It's really hard for me to imagine how they go through this season. Triantos does what you expect him to do, which is continue to have really good bat to ball skills. He's a very good and aggressive base runner who improved by leaps and bounds his defense last year. I think the big question was, is he even going to have a defensive home? There are people who are now relatively confident he could play second, he could play third. Obviously, if you stick him out in left field, he'll be fine. That's all the versatility you need from one bench piece if he's that, Tommy La Stella style bat, to pick one relatively familiar comp for Cubs fans. But I mean, he's a right-hander. He may have more pop than La Stella. It's not perfect, but you see where I'm driving there. I think Triantos, it's so easy to just think of him as a poor man's Matt Shaw, but he's more than that, even if he's less than Shaw. And I would not be shocked at all if we're hearing his name in a big way come Memorial Day, because Dansby or Nico had another injury or sort of a recurrence of what they've been dealing with, or Shaw is struggling and going through adjustments with that leg kick like we just talked about. There are a lot of ways that it could be James Triantos. There are a fair number of ways that by June or July it could be Ballesteros, probably not as a catcher. Right? He's a catcher in name. People probably know this by now, but I think of him a little more as like when they called up Kyle Schwarber in 2015. Yeah, he was there to be the third catcher on the team. He was also there to play some left field. Basically, it was, we're going to get that bat in the lineup.
Yes.
Holy smokes, it's ready. There's no sense in leaving it at AAA any longer. I think we might reach that point with Moises Ballesteros pretty quickly. He's not that level of damage doer as Schwarber. He's going to lose more value if he can't stick behind the plate than Schwarber did, because the power is not off the charts. But if it's Justin Turner who gets hurt, or if it's Ian Happ or it's, say, a Suzuki who gets hurt, and that means sliding and moving pieces around until there's just a lot of DH or first base or those kinds of at bats missing, Ballesteros fits it like a glove. And obviously, pretty much anything bad happening to PCA, whether it's performance related or he tries to literally run through the bricks and ivy, which we shouldn't put beyond him, then Kevin Alcantara is going to be knocking on the door. So all three of those guys, it's so hard for me to picture a scenario where all three of those guys don't play in the big leagues this year for the Cubs unless one of them is traded. It's either by the end of this year, each of those guys will be able to say, I wore a Chicago Cubs jersey, no Iowa scrawled across it, or I no longer play for the Cubs. I was dealt somewhere else. I have to think so.
Good problem to have if all of it, comes to fruition in the way that the Cubs hope that it will, with those prospects, countless others. I'm going to toss one more name your direction. Again, just picking your brain. Cade Horton. Live action. Last time he's seen it, I think it was last June. Season-ending injury. I think he faced live hitters last week for the first time in a long time. What's like you're not going to rush him and his timeline up now, especially after the injury he went through. What do you think is like ideal scenario for him this year? Is it just to keep getting reps at the minor league level, build that strength back up, try to keep that consistency going? Because entering last year, I think a lot of people would have circled him as like the guy that a lot of people were most giddy about before he suffered that injury and was shut down in June. So what are you making of Cade Horton and kind of what to expect this year maybe out of him?
It's probably the right way to feel at the time. And the only reason I'd be less inclined, I don't want to lump him in with those hitters we just talked about, for the simple reason that more things have to go right to put him in that position where he's ready for that, because we know there aren't many innings built up. He's just not very built up because of the injury. And we have to see coming out the other side of the injury. There were some weird things with his pitch shapes last year in Iowa. They kind of conformed to what the Cubs like pitchers to do. So I feel like maybe they were asking him to do it, but it wasn't that good for his arm. I wouldn't be surprised if we see some of that change this year. Tyler Zombro got hired this winter as a special assistant. He's really big on motor preference. So guys who naturally, turn the hand one direction or the other at release, that kind of stuff. If he's seeing that what they had Horton working on was working against his sort of body wiring, there might be a little more of an overhaul to what he does pitch type wise. than we're expecting. So I think there could just be a lot more work building him out again and making sure that you're not starting from scratch. The raw stuff's still there. But I think there could be bigger tweaks than we maybe realize still left for him to make before he's big league ready. Plus, there's that innings count worry. Plus, more stuff has to go wrong for the other players to put Horton in a situation where you need him. You really, I would love to not see the Cubs have to seriously entertain bringing up Cade Horton this year, because that means at least half your bullpen additions worked out. That means the main five who are slated to start the year right now do reasonably well at staying healthy in the rotation. You're obviously going to mix in Javier Assad when he gets back from the oblique strain. You've also got Ben Brown and some stretched out, sort of multi-inning relief types who can also swing into starting roles, like Cody Poteet, maybe Nate Pearson. I'm not sold on that one, but it's certainly one kind of option. You've got guys that you would turn to before Horton anyway.
Even
Jordan
Wicks.
Obviously. Yeah, definitely. I always forget Jordan Wicks. I can say this because his face and my face are not so different. He's got a very forgettable face. But anyway, you got to go further down the depth chart to find Horton. He's got to have done enough things right in the meantime to rise to meet that opportunity if and when it comes. I just think that the chances of needing him are definitely lower. And if you do need him, it's a lot scarier of a proposition than it is if, I completely understand how Kevin Alcantara gets into the lineup by Cinco de Mayo. If Cade Horton is pitching at Wrigley by Cinco de Mayo,
lots going on.
I'm worried. I'm real worried.
Yeah, that's a good way to kind of phrase it and view it through that lens. Last thing for you on the agenda today, Matt. I was kind of scrolling through like my own thoughts on who's got the best rotation, who's got the best bullpen, best infield, best outfield, and kind of categorizing by that.
That's what we do in March, isn't it?
Yeah, and I was kind of pissed that the Dodgers were near the top for me and a lot of those, but it's the way of the world right now. Cubs outfield, left to right, Hap, PCA, Kyle Tucker. That was the one that I circled back to, and I was like, am I just wearing Cubs goggles, or is there a case, Matt, where you could say they have, entering the season, maybe a top 3 outfield? Like of the group, I'm not talking individually, because I'm looking at the Padres and I see Merrill and Tatis. The Yankees have Judge and Bellinger and presumably Dominguez. And when the Braves are healthy, it's Harris and it's Acuna and Profar's out there now. But Hap, PCA, Tucker, like where would you slot that trio in when you're talking about the best outfields entering the season this year?
Yeah. I think if Atlanta's healthy, they're probably number one.
Yep.
I'm a Jurickson Profar believer. I think most of now, what is that? Again, we're talking about how to set expectations, I guess. But I don't think last year's big, announcement of I'm finally going to live up to my potential. Here I am. I don't think that was all smoke and mirrors. I think Jurickson Profar is probably going to hold on to some of that value. We know what the other two of those guys can do. There's the funny thing is a lot of the other outfields in the league have 2 really strong components and then one glaring weakness. Like
that's why I said Merrill, Tatis in San Diego, and then I stopped. Right, I said Judge and Bellinger with the Yankees, and then I hesitated and I threw in Dominguez. But yeah, exactly. That's why I'm talking all 3 as a trio. You could make a compelling case for the Cubs, right? As like top 3, maybe 4. I don't know.
I think so. I think it's how much you believe in PCA ends up mattering a lot, right? Because the Mets have Juan Soto and they have Brandon Nimmo in the corners. That's really good. I think we can pretty fairly say that as much as we like Kyle Tucker, Andy, and Hap, those two, Soto and Nimmo have like a tiny advantage over those two, or they're dead even. Then it comes down to, do you believe PCA is going to hit? Because if he can hit, then you just won that battle. Because the Mets have Jose Siri
in
in
center.
center field. Jose Siri, who swings and misses at everything, but he is an elite defender. So if that's all PCA is, it's hard to push him ahead of the Mets. If PCA's anything more, really, then I think you do. You have that edge. So what PCA turns out to be decides a lot of this. But just on paper, hard to push him out, I think, of the top 5. There are a lot of outfields with one missing ingredient or one really weak link in the chain. The Cubs don't have that because even if PCA is not great, he sets a very high floor for himself with that glove.
Do you think there's other, like, let's just say the average baseball fan, however you want to define that, Matt? Because again, I brought up, like, maybe I'm wearing my Cubs goggles. Because, like, when I brought up the Yankees, I was like, well, Judge, Bellinger, obviously Soto's gone. And I was like, and Dominguez. And I'm sure there's a lot of Yankees fans who are still high on Dominguez. Do you think these other fan bases, if they were to go through and rank outfields, do they say, oh, there's Happ and Tucker and there's PCA? Like, do you think that's how they view it? Like, am I wearing the goggles? Is that how other fans are viewing it with the Cubs? Like, yeah, that's a good outfield with Happ and Tucker at the corners, but PCA kind of TBD, right? Like, to be determined, or we'll see how it goes. You don't think so? Because the glove's that good.
How this goes. you know what everybody else in the league is doing is they're going, boy, Tucker and PCA, yeah, but it's just Ian Happ and left field. That's what's happening. That's what's happening. I mean, they're really when we talk about the average baseball fan, they're more casual than you and I in all likelihood. And they're also quite focused on their own team. And of course, we have some of that bias as well. And we've got to think about, like you just did, go pause and say, am I underselling Jason Dominguez just because he didn't deliver on the hype right away? That's really good to do. Most people aren't going to meet you at that level. What they're also not going to do is properly value guys who have solid track records, but aren't superstars. And that's how, Ian Happ is probably the one people are going to systematically underrate from outside our Chicago sphere, as opposed to PCA, because they're going to see the promise in PCA. You can see it when he shows up on your highlight reel. Ian Happ doesn't make great highlight reels. So, that's probably what's missing. And it probably is worth remembering that, just so we can step back and say, like with the Brewers, whom I'm around right now, Sal Frelick is a phenomenal defensive outfielder. See, the kind of hitter you want to have in a corner most of the time? Not really, but there's upside from where he's been, and he gets on base a decent amount. Garrett Mitchell is like, what if PCA had better power, but also got hurt all the time? So, if he stays healthy, then that's going to be really interesting in a real hurry. Jackson Chourio, superstar. Just superstar, end of story. And then you also mix in Christian Yelich getting some time in left field. And boy, the Brewers have an argument for being just as good as the Cubs, but we wouldn't be inclined necessarily to think of it that way, because we tend to glaze over what the imminent upside of a Frelick and a Mitchell are. Yeah, that's happening everywhere. Everybody is more aware of both the upside and the warts of their own players than when they look almost anywhere else in the league, even at teams that are as close to each other and sort of intermingled as the Cubs and Brewers are. So, yeah, it's happening, but that doesn't mean that your perspective's not valid and that the possibility isn't real. The Cubs have one of the best outfields in baseball. Could it be the best? That'd take a really good season from PCA, but it's possible.
Yeah, well put. Matt, I had a ton of fun doing this with you. It is the Northside Baseball podcast, our website, Northside Baseball, YouTube channel that is getting built up slowly but surely, Apple Podcast, as we get this podcast kind of lifted up off the ground. Had a great time, had a blast with you today, Matt. Appreciate you jumping on.
Yeah, thanks, man. Yeah, I love listening to you and Jason on episode 1. I think this is going to be really great. Keep it up.
Yeah, this has been the Northside Baseball podcast, and we'll see you next time.